I wrote 3 books that didn't sell. When you are a new writer trying to sell your debut novel in genre fiction, you need to do something that's the same but different. So it took a while for me to be able to develop the tools that allowed me to tell the stories that I wanted to tell in a manner that made my work attractive enough for somebody to buy, because it's really hard if you're creating any kind of art, right? If you look back across human history, some of the most powerful truths that were communicated were done through fables or parables. We are preconditioned to appreciate storytelling. And I think some of the most effective self-help books or business books incorporate business cases or stories. I think as human beings, we're just pre-wired to be able to listen to stories, to want to communicate through storytelling. I know how to sell it to somebody. If they don't know how to sell it, it's going to be really hard for you to sell it, and you should be able to tell them that. Here are the authors that I write like.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. I'm your host, Nikki Ballou. And boy, do we have an exciting guest lined up for you today. Today's guest is a repeat guest. He is a #1 best-selling author. He has his own series of books, thriller books, featuring the intrepid hero, Matt Drake. He also writes for the Tom Clancy universe. I'm speaking, of course, of none other than the one, the only, the legendary Don Bentley. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thanks, Nikki. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. It's a beautiful sunny day in Toronto. You know, I'm sitting overlooking the beach from my office. What could be better? What could be better?
Can't really argue with that, huh?
Oh, no, you can't. You can't. So, Don, you got a new Matt Drake book out. It's called Forgotten War. And I actually read it, which is what prompted me to reach out to you and say, man, this is really good. You want to come back on the show? Let's talk about it. And then I said, yeah, we're talking about this today. It's good. So, you know, it's a little bit of a departure, I think, in some respect from some of the other books, but it's equally good, if not better in many, many ways. Let's talk about it. What made you come up with the idea for this particular book? Walk us through it.
Sure. So Forgotten War, like you said, is the 4th book in the series. And as I was getting ready to write it, kind of real world events intervened and took the book a different direction than maybe I would have otherwise. And so the real world events I'm talking about are our withdrawal, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. And so I'm a veteran in Afghanistan. I served there from 2005 to 2006 as an Army Air Cavalry Troop Commander. And as I was watching kind of 20 years worth of blood and treasure and sacrifice just go down the drain, I was trading texts and calls with other friends of mine that were veterans, and the question that seemed to come up over and over again was some variation of, was it worth it? Was the time we spent there worth it? Was the blood, the brothers and sisters we lost there worth it? Was any of it worth it? And I couldn't answer that question. And so what I did, what I think writers do, and tried to answer that question in the book Forgotten War. And so Forgotten War, like you said, is a little bit different in that it takes place in 2021, partially during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then there's another timeline that takes place 10 years earlier. And the reason why it's set that way is that when the book starts, Matt and his best friend Frodo are in a bar, and they are both Army veterans. And Frodo is arrested by 2 Army CID or Criminal Investigation Division folks for allegedly a murder that took place 10 years earlier in Afghanistan. And so Matt kind of springs into action because he was there when Frodo allegedly committed the crime, and tries to figure out what actually happened that day. And what he discovers is that the men who were with them, the other commandos who were with them that day when the murder allegedly occurred, have begun to die one by one under mysterious circumstances. And so the only person left alive who was in the room with Frodo was their Afghan interpreter. And so Matt has to go to Afghanistan to find this guy as Afghanistan is collapsing around him.
Yeah, it's a heck of a story, a very powerful and human story. We don't want to give away the goods, no spoilers here, but as someone who's a veteran of the Afghan
Mhm.
wars of the last 20 years, I'm just curious, you know, what was going through your head? What emotions were you feeling when the Biden administration started to give back all the hard-won gains that the United States had purchased there with blood and treasure over the last 20 years?
Sure. Yeah, so it was kind of two conflicting things, and I'll say that because so my oldest son, I just went to Quantico, Virginia, to see him graduate from the second half of Marine Corps officer candidate school, and so when he graduates from college this year, he'll be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marines. So I was incredibly proud
Congratulations.
of him, but he was born shortly after September 11th, and so as a father and a veteran, I found it hard to come to terms with the notion that our children might have to go back to Afghanistan a generation later to do, what to carry on what fight that we couldn't resolve ourselves, the 20 years prior to that. And so I think, like a lot of veterans, I was probably ready for us to be done with Afghanistan. I just wasn't ready for the way in which it ended. And I think the overwhelming sentiment that I got from fellow Afghan veterans and honestly people who served in Iraq and Syria and stuff too is that we deserved a better ending than this. Like, yes, I think we were pretty content not to have American sons and daughters have to go serve and potentially die in Afghanistan again. But at the same time, the way in which it ended just felt like that what we did and what we sacrificed was for nothing, and that was very hard to come to terms with. And so that was kind of the common thread, was this sense of frustration that we were owed a better ending than the one that we got based on the sacrifices that we made. And so that very heavily influenced Forgotten War. It certainly is a book of fiction, and it's designed to keep you up way past your bedtime. It's not a nonfiction account of Afghanistan or trying to drive a political message by any stretch. But what I like to tell folks is, while the book is fiction, many of the operations depicted or referenced in Forgotten War actually happened or were based on things that actually happened, and the sentiment expressed by the cast of characters there, particularly the veterans, is very much reflects the sentiment that I heard expressed to me as I was interviewing friends as I was writing this book.
Well, before the Biden administration took power, seem to recall that the Trump administration had made a deal with the Taliban basically to withdraw in a orderly fashion. Um, and, I was expecting the Trump administration to be reelected and to continue. And obviously, when that didn't happen, what shocked me, as a non-veteran, even frankly as a Canadian, not an American in there, is the amount of military hardware that was left behind that did not need to
Yeah.
be left behind. And I'm I'm trying to understand. Am I wrong in saying that did not need to be left behind? Right, the American military could have easily made plans to take all that hardware with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that for sure is one of the tragedies, and one of the jarring things is to think, that we could potentially, or our sons and daughters now could potentially face adversaries that are equipped with the very things that we left behind in Afghanistan. And so, I mean, there's a whole litany of things that you can go through and say, okay, if this was the plan, if this was the directive that we were going to get to zero boots on the ground in Afghanistan, why was it done this way? And I think that was not an insignificant portion, but just more felt like rubbing sand in your wounds to see, or rubbing salt in your wounds rather, to see, Black Hawk helicopters flying around with Taliban sympathetic pilots at the control now is certainly a crazy thing I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, for sure.
the powerful thing about your writing is it seems to be ripped from the headlines. The previous Matt Drake book you wrote was about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you seem to be prescient. You foretold that was going to happen. So is your next book going to like foreshadow some other series of geopolitical events? Brother, what's going on here?
Yeah. You kind of hope not, but I think that's one of the things as a thriller writer, specifically as a writer who writes political intrigue or international intrigue. What you're trying to do is look at the world and imagine what could be, frankly, from a negative perspective, and then how that would play out. And that's one of the things, honestly, being an Army officer or a military officer in general, kind of makes you uniquely suited for. And the reason why I say that is that in the military, there's a position called the S2, which is the staff officer in charge of military intelligence. And so when you sit down to run a war game, that man or woman plays the role of the enemy. And so you actually set up an entire map board. And as you're walking through the operation, you have the blue forces on one side, which are, if you're running a battalion or squadron level exercise, are all the company and troop commanders talking through, here's my task and purpose, here's what I'm going to do. And then the man or woman who is the S2 says, here's what the enemy's going to do, and here's how they're going to react to what you've just done. And so that, every officer at one time or another plays that role or has that intelligence background. And so it helps a lot as a novelist, because you're able to look out and then put yourself in the bad guy's shoes and say, okay, what would I do? How would I imagine this would go out? And so Forgotten Wars is the fourth book in my Matt Drake series, but the next book of mine that comes out is actually the fourth book in my Tom Clancy series. It's called Weapons Grade. And so that one actually takes a look at another kind of current event, in that it looks at the Iranian WMD program, and particularly the Iranians creeping towards having enough enriched uranium to form a nuclear bomb. And so it's another one. Hopefully that doesn't come to fruition, but it's what we try and do, not necessarily beat the headlines, but to be able to look out and say, what are some real world problems that I think are on the horizon, and can I write about them in a way that's compelling to readers?
Well, I'm actually originally from Iran, and I left Iran in 1980.
Okay.
And it was August 21st, 1980. We left Iran. We went to Greece, spent a couple years there, and came here. And I'm very proud of my heritage, but I would be horrified if the regime in Iran today got its hands on nuclear weapons. I think that would be very destabilizing, very dangerous for the world as a whole, and could bring the world to the brink of war, quite frankly, and not just be a regional war. I think if the Israeli government felt that the Iranian government was getting its hands on nuclear weapons, the raid that they had in Iraq back in '81 is going to look like a trifle compared to what they're going to try to do to make sure that Iran doesn't get its hands on a weapon. And I think that if somehow they're unable to successfully stop Iran from getting a weapon, there's no question in my mind that there's going to be people in the Iranian regime that would advocate using that weapon immediately against Israel and possibly even other enemies in the region. So crazy. You think about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's part of what my book looks at, because the raid that you mentioned in 1981 was just against a singular nuclear reactor. That the nuclear weapons program was very isolated back then, or in its infancy. The Iranian one is now across multiple sites across the country. That it would not be as simplistic as a pair of F-16s going to bomb a single nuclear reactor. And I think you're right. I think the Israeli government across many different subsequent governments has made it very clear that they do not intend to exist with a nuclear armed Iran. And so I think that would be, and that actually plays into the book. In the book, the Iranians discover that, the Israelis discover that the Iranians have been secretly enriching uranium, and kind of give the U.S. an ultimatum that says either we'll take care of it, and it'll be very, very messy, and could result in starting another world war just with us taking care of it, or you, the United States, have to deal with it. And unfortunately, that could be a situation we find ourselves in real life as well.
Yeah. The other major situation that we could find ourselves in real life is having the Chinese Communist Party decide that they're going to invade Taiwan and
Yeah.
Reclaim the lost province, as it were. And
Yeah.
I'm, as you say, you do your best not to get political, but I don't have any such constraints. If the Biden administration is in charge, I don't think that's going to be good for the world. If Donald Trump somehow gets back in office, and that's an open question right now with all these charges that are thrown against him, it feels like the U.S. is going through its banana republic phase right now, Don. With the main adversary to the current occupant of the White House is now the target of all these raids. I never thought I'd see this in America in my life. I just thought Americans don't do this. Even if there's a reason to do it, they don't do this because they're better than this. But no, it's it's happening. But if Trump's in charge, I think some of those threats will not be quite as serious as they now are. If Biden stays in charge, all bets are off, in my opinion.
Well, I think the Clancy book that I just released 2 months ago was called Flashpoint, and it has to do with China trying to take Taiwan and kind of a conflict in the South China Sea. And I think politics aside, the conclusion that is pretty that I don't think anybody can argue with when you look at Ukraine and Russia is that it's far more cost effective and just effective in general to provide the nation at risk with the weapons they want before an invasion happens, as opposed to trying it afterwards. And I think if you take that and look at the China and the Taiwan situation, I think it would be much more cost effective in dollars and potentially American lives to turn Taiwan into a porcupine right now, as opposed to potentially reacting to Chinese aggression after the fact. And I just wish if we could, like I said, if we were capable of taking some lessons learned from the Ukraine and Russia scenario, that would be the one that we would take to heart right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, again, I'm going to get a little political here, but I think the current administration is utterly incompetent. Utterly incompetent. I mean, they make Jimmy Carter look competent, and that's tough.
Yeah, like I said, I try and steer clear the politics thing, but I think you can draw that lesson pretty definitively, and I wish we were working harder to apply that right now.
Damn straight, man. Damn straight. There's no question about it. All right, switching gears. How'd you come up with the Matt Drake character? I've always wanted to ask you that.
Yeah, so I wrote 3 books before. So Without Sanction is the first book in the Matt Drake series, and I wrote 3 books before that that didn't sell. And so my editor for both my Tom Clancy and Matt Drake books is a guy named Tom Colgan, and he likes to say that when you are a new writer trying to sell your debut novel in genre fiction, you need to do something that's the same but different. And so what he means by that is that Brad Taylor is a great friend of mine. He's a former Delta Force officer who writes the New York Times bestselling Pike Logan series. And so our books should be shelved in the same area of a bookstore because they're both espionage or military thrillers. But I'm never going to write a better Brad book than Brad is. And so when I sat down to write Without Sanction, I thought really hard about that. And I thought, what are the things that I can do that are the same but different? And so I made a couple of choices that influenced who Matt Drake is as a character. And so the first one being, when I looked out at the genre, there were a lot of rough, tough assassins and special forces folks and things like that. But I didn't see too many authors using humor. And so one of my favorite writers is Nelson DeMille, who was kind enough to blurb Forgotten War. And he has a series character called John Corey that first appears in this book called Plum Island. And he is a really witty New York cop, a detective. And I remember reading that, his first book, and I told my wife, like, I would read about John Corey going to the gas station because he's so funny and so much fun to be with. And I thought, not a whole lot of people do that in the genre I'm trying to write. But the people I know, over my time in the military and the FBI, and then later working with customers in the special operations community, many of them have a sense of humor, a sense of gallows humor that allows them to mitigate the really awful circumstances they find themselves in, to make light of it. And so I decided to include that in my book and make Matt Drake kind of a witty guy. And so you see a lot of humor in my books. The second thing is that Matt Drake is what's called a case officer, which is just a fancy way of saying he's a spy, and he works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA. And so DIA is an agency that is kind of a rival to the CIA. They have a lot of conflict because they have a very similar mission set. And when I looked out at the genre, I didn't see a whole lot of folks who were writing about that. And so Matt's job is to run and recruit what in the intelligence community we call assets, or when I was an FBI agent, what we call sources. And so my job as an FBI agent was to run and recruit sources. And I thought, that's another thing I can bring to this book series that makes it a little bit the same but different. And then the final part is that when I sat down to write Without Sanction, I thought, you know what, I'm finally going to put the things in this book that have kept me up at night, that were things that were influential in my life and my career. And so when I was deployed to Afghanistan, I had a really bad day on June 28th, 2005. And I think a lot of people who are in that business have a really bad day at one point or another. And so, and Without Sanction, Matt Drake has a really bad day in Syria that costs him the life of his asset and his asset's family, and horribly cripples his best friend Frodo. And so the kind of things that Matt has to deal with and Without Sanction, things like survivor's guilt and the PTSD and such that comes with it, are things that reflected some of what I dealt with, and certainly a lot of what friends of mine who were veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan had to navigate as well. And so I think all of those things together are what made Matt Drake who he is, and I think also helped satisfy that formula of offering something that's the same but different.
I like this, the same but different. Your friend Tom Kogan, he sounds like he really is a perceptive and brilliant man. And
yeah,
all the things you've explained about what guided your thinking in creating the Matt Drake character, they make a lot of sense. Yeah, it is in the thriller genre. Yeah, it's in the international intrigue world, but you're dealing with a DIA officer, not a CIA officer. They compete with the CIA. They're almost seen as a lesser cousin to the CIA by some people, right? So there's a bit of a chip on the shoulder action going on over there. That comes through there, which is kind of cool. Recruiting assets, I thought that was cool. The fact that Matt Drake had some bad days. You took a bad day that you had in Afghanistan. I wrote it down. I mean, that's pretty wild that you had to go through that. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And survivor's guilt, PTSD, all those things. That's powerful. And to me, it seems like if you're a writer, you need to come up with conventions in your genre that other writers are respecting, and you can't completely stray from those. But you do also need to bring something to the table that is different, that is new, that really helps
absolutely
get people pulled in. I love Matt Drake. I'm buying every book you write about him. I pre-order, man. As soon as the thing comes out, I'm like always pre-order. I read your Clancy books too. They're really, really good too. But I'm getting into the Matt Drake stuff, and I think it's really fantastic.
I appreciate you saying that, and I get they're both amazing to write. And starting next year in 2024, I'm taking over the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series, and so I'm really excited about that. Yeah. It's I'm actually thank you. It's pretty awesome. I'm actually writing my first Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp book now, and it'll come out in September 2024. But it is It's definitely a privilege to be able to do both, because you can certainly do things in the world that you create that you aren't able to do in some of the legacy series. But the legacy series for me, Vince Flynn is my favorite author. He's the one. When my second or third book didn't sell, I actually took my favorite Vince Flynn book and took note cards and plotted it out and taped it to the wall of my bedroom because I didn't have an office at the time. And it was, for me, that really was kind of the difference between looking at a house and looking at the blueprint of a house. For the first time, I could kind of see how he did what he did, and what were some of the things that he employed in order to get the incredible stories that he wrote. And so being able to now take over his series for him is pretty incredible. So, but it's a lot of fun, but it also, all of it together is a lot of responsibility, because those fans love those legacy characters. They love, I got, when they announced that I was taking over for Kyle Mills, who's retiring from writing the Mitch Rapp books. It was, most of the comments and emails and stuff I got from fans were positive, but they were all something similar to, welcome to the club, but this is my favorite character ever, so don't screw this up. And
Don't
I think
screw
that's
this up.
a fair thing to say, right? Is that they are invested over, almost 20 years in this character, and they want him to live on, but they also want you to stay true to what Vince Flynn's original intention for those characters were.
You know, Vince Flynn and Tom Clancy both died in the same year, and
Mm-hmm.
they were and remain two of my favorite writers in the
Yeah.
thriller genre of all time. Um, Vince had a way of injecting humanity into his stories
Yeah.
that was incredible. You know,
Yeah.
people in his books, in his original stories, they weren't black and white. They were
Mm-hmm.
human beings, on both sides of the conflicts, the
Yeah.
guys and the bad guys. And
Yeah.
he had a way of telling a powerful story, but also imparting powerful lessons. And his
Yeah.
lessons were straightforward. He believed in America. He believed in the promise of America. He believed
Yeah.
that America was only going to remain safe as long as there were, good men and women that were willing to fight, bleed, and die for her. And it was important that they
Yeah.
be celebrated. And I think he wrote his books not just because he wanted to be a famous writer, he became a famous writer, but because he had a message to give to the next generation. And I also
Yeah.
believe Tom Clancy was like that too. When I first read The Hunt for Red October, um, the one thing that struck me about that book was how powerful Clancy's love was for the honorable men and women that were part of um, the American submarine um,
Yeah.
service, and how powerful his love even was for Marco Ramius, who was the Russian
Mm-hmm.
skipper of the hunt of the Red October, who in his
Yep.
own way was a very honorable man and was trying to do what he believed to be right. And I learned from reading those books. I read those
Yeah.
books when I was a younger man to learn how to be a man. Those books
Yeah.
taught me lessons. And not to put more pressure on you, Don, but that's really what you're doing with the Mitch Rapp series. Is you're not just telling great
Yeah.
stories, man. You're teaching young men, because a lot of your audience for these books are going to be young men. You're teaching them how to be a man.
Yeah.
You're teaching them how to keep their word. You're teaching them how to put service above self. You're teaching them how to be somebody that other people admire and can count on, man. And I'm excited for you, and it's an incredible thing. Congratulations.
I appreciate you saying that, and I agree with that. I think, um, when you read a Vince Flynn book, you can't help but come away with, like you said, the love and respect that he felt for his country and the men and women who go into harm's way on her behalf. And I think, as a writer, he was the first kind of post 9/11 thriller writer to write this protagonist that unabashedly his job was to go hunt down the nation, his nation's enemies, to go hunt down terrorists, to go get them in their caves so they couldn't hurt people here. And every single one of us who writes in that genre now owe a debt to Vince Flynn for that. And I think all of us, if you look at our protagonists, there are shades of Mitch Rapp and every one of the protagonists of folks who write that now, because he was the first, just like Tom Clancy was the first military techno thriller writer. Vince Flynn did the same thing for the post 9/11 war on terror. He really did open up that genre, and I think perfectly capture the attitude of most Americans towards the men and women who were serving on their behalf during that time.
Amen. Amen. Brilliantly said. Brilliantly said. To me, a good writer is somebody who doesn't want to just become famous or rich or what have you. A good writer is somebody that has something to say, something deep in their soul that was put in there by God, and they feel strongly that it's their duty to get that message out in their work. And the reason they write is because they want somebody who's reading that book, somebody maybe earlier on in their stage of life, a younger person, to read that and to have it touch their soul in the deepest possible way and give them a bit of faith, a bit of hope, a bit of inspiration, a bit of courage, so that in their life, whatever their life is about, they can bring that and live life as a better version of themselves. That's what I always felt I got from the great writers whose books that I read, people like Tom Clancy, like Vince Flynn, and yourself, Jack Higgins back in the day, when he was writing, books like The Eagle Has Landed. And I'm tickled pink that I get to have this conversation with you, man. This is pretty awesome.
No, I appreciate it. I think, one of my good friends is Nick Petrie, who writes his first book is called The Drifter, but he writes this character called Peter Ash. And he told me once that in a really good book, what's happening is that the author is trying to answer a question for themselves in the pages of their book, or trying to find the answer to a question that they're wrestling with in the pages of the book. And so I think as a fiction writer, your first job is to tell a really, really great story. And I think sometimes if people approach it too much from the standpoint of, here's this thing I want to beat you over the head with, audience, that it comes off as kind of preachy, and readers don't want that. But I think if you are telling a really compelling story, you're probably wrestling with something that you're trying to figure out in the pages of that book too. And if you do it well, it's certainly going to give the reader something to think about when they're done reading the book too, hopefully.
Yeah, and that's really what I think good fiction can do. There's a lot of folks in the type of business that I'm in who brag that they don't read fiction, they only read nonfiction. And I just, whenever I hear them say that, I just shake my head. I go, man, do you have any idea how dumb that sounds? Do you have any idea how dumb you sound when you say that? The most ennobling work is that of a storyteller who tells a brilliant story that connects us all with our shared humanity. And you learn more from great fiction than you ever could from a how-to book. And I'm a fellow who writes how-to books and reads how-to books. But it's the truth, No,
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, that's, if you look back across human history, some of the most powerful truths that were communicated were done through fables or parables or things. And that's the reason why we are preconditioned to appreciate storytelling. And I think, even if you look in nonfiction book, in some of the most effective business case or some of the most effective self-help books or business books incorporate business cases or stories in there, because it's still, even if it's nonfiction, you're using the medium of storytelling in order to communicate. And I think as human beings, we're just pre-wired to be able to listen to stories, to want to communicate through storytelling.
Absolutely. 100%. And more people are starting to realize this in the work that, I do professionally.
Yeah.
And I think that when someone like you gets to do what they do, what's brilliant about it is you touch the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, but you also inspire the next generation of writers to come up and say, yeah, man, if this guy
Sure.
can do it, maybe I can do it. Maybe it's possible for me too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
delve into that from your perspective when you were kind of on your journey before you achieved
Yeah.
your success and fame. Walk us through that for a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to be a storyteller, and so I even when I was a kid mowing the grass or something, I'd be telling myself a story as I'm mowing the grass, or I'd read a book or watch a movie, and if it wasn't great, I'd think about how it could have been great. What choices, what different storytelling choices could the writers have made? And so it took a while for me to be able to develop the tools that allowed me to tell the stories that I wanted to tell in a manner that made my work attractive enough for somebody to buy, because it's really hard if you're creating any kind of art, right? To be a good enough singer or songwriter for people to spend money on your album, and the same thing if you're a writer. For me, the first person that got me excited about writing and wanting to be writing was Tom Clancy, and it wasn't Red Storm Rising is the one a lot of people cite. I love that book, but mine was Red Storm Rising, not Hunt for the Red October. And there's a scene in there where there's an F-14 pilot who's doing strafing runs on this Russian cargo ship, and I just remember feeling like I was sitting in the cockpit as he was doing it, and I knew it was fiction, but at the same time, I couldn't help but thinking it was real at the same time. And I just remember thinking, I don't know how he did that, but I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to tell stories that are so compelling that the reader knows there's fiction, but still, believes that they're true. And so certainly, Tom Clancy was a big part of that journey. Like I said, Vince Flynn was a big part of that journey. And more contemporary, I've just been very, very fortunate to have friends like Brad Taylor and Mark Graney, and I mentioned Nick Petrie before, who really invested in me when I was a young writer trying to figure it out, and were willing to answer questions about writing, and that's one of the conferences I still try to go to every year. It's called Thriller Fest in New York, and that's where I met a lot of those folks, and they have great writing classes and such there. But you can also, for the price of a beer, get a master's class in the business of writing or something like that, where you just, buy a writer a beer or something and ask them questions. What's it like to write? What's it like to have your book come out? What are the things you wish you would have done differently? And Jack Carr is another great example. Like his first book, Terminal List, came out just a couple of years before Without Sanction, but he has upended the entire how books are marketed and sold with everything he's done. And he's another incredibly generous person, and always willing to talk, always willing to give a little advice on things that worked for him or didn't. And I think I can't talk about the book community in general, though I suspect it's very similar just because I don't have experience with it. But the thriller genre is made up of people who genuinely want to see you succeed, and I've certainly been a beneficiary of that.
Amen, man. These are all amazing people. I'd love to interview all of them. I've interviewed you. I've interviewed Peter Kirsanow. Do you know Peter?
I don't.
So he was hired by the W.E.B. Griffin estate to take over the writing of those books.
Yep.
Those are fun books as well. And he's got a series of his own books too. And he also he's an attorney by day, and he serves on the Civil Rights Commission too. Really, really good man. Really smart guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a cool guy. I should connect the two of you. I think you'd like each other. I think you'd like to talk to each other, man. You're up to some similar stuff.
Yeah, we probably have the same editor. Had the same editor, because my editor Tom Colgan also does the W.E.B. Griffin books.
Well, there you go. So they yeah. So there you go. But he's been very generous with his time to me, and he's been very generous coming on the show. And I
That's
think
awesome.
going to be coming on again. I love this stuff. I think it's great. It's been a dream of mine to get a book, a fiction book published, not self-published, published. So I'm going.
Yep. Yep.
And
that's awesome.
Thank you. So you've got two legacy series you're working on. You got your own book that you put out there. So
yeah,
what does this What does this mean? Excuse me, in terms of your writing schedule, you must be darn tightly scheduled, right?
Yeah, I actually once I got the opportunity to write the Vince Flynn books, I kind of took a step back from everything else for the first Vince Flynn book. And so right now I'm only working on that one. My editor for the Tom Clancy and my Matt Drake books, Tom Colgan, is a great guy. And I was able to talk to him and say, hey, I need to take a break for a little bit while I work on this Mitch Rapp book. And so I'm lucky enough where I have more irons in the fire than I can, I guess, hammer at any one time. And so what my plan is to finish this Mitch Rapp book and then look and see if I'm going to do another Matt Drake book right away, or do a standalone, or potentially do something else. I told him I couldn't do at least the next Clancy book. So I think he's going to find somebody else to do those. So I don't know that I will, certainly not right away, continue the Clancy books, but I am not, I'm still going to do something of mine, and I'm just not sure what that is yet. So like I said, he's an incredible guy, and we kind of came to an agreement that I would check in with him in a couple of months and see where I am on the Mitch Rapp book, and then see what I do next. But it's kind of crazy. It went from, like I said, the first three books were over 17 years that nobody really cared what I wrote, and then success came pretty quickly. But I think that's the case with most, kind of quote unquote overnight successes, is you don't see the years and years and years of toiling before that, before the big break finally happens.
That's a powerful way for us to land this plane today.
Yeah.
So Don, can you tell us what the title of the Rapp book is, or is that still a state secret for now?
No, it's a state secret. And to be honest, I'm still in the very beginning stages of that. So I don't know if I could tell you what the title was, even if I had an idea.
All right. Fair enough. But hey, when it comes closer to the time where you can talk about it, I'd love to bring you back on. I think it'd be
absolutely
fun. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
So Don, we like to end off every episode with a couple things. First of all, folks, go to Amazon or wherever you happen to buy your books, type in Don Bentley, go look at his entire list and pick a few books and buy them and read them. I'd suggest that you buy the first couple Matt Drake books and then a couple of the Tom Clancy books. Don is a brilliant writer. He does a great job. If you've read Tom Clancy before and you like his work, you're going to love Don's stuff. He stayed very true to the characters and the stories. And the Matt Drake books are similar but different. They're awesome. So just go ahead and do that right now. Just go type in Don Bentley in Amazon, pick them out, put them in your cart, click the buy button. So that's number one. Number two, I bet you never had anybody do that before on the podcast, right?
No, first time.
There you go. So secondly, Don, we like to end off every episode by asking you, as our guest expert, to give what we call your top 3 expert action steps. These are your best bullet point pieces of advice to help the folks listening, get into immediate action and make things better for themselves. So what do you say?
Yes. So if you want to be a writer of commercial fiction, there are a couple things I tell everybody to do. And so the first is, if you're working on a book and you can't tell me what writers your book should be shelved next to, then you have a problem, because you are, in commercial fiction, the person who buys your book and the bookseller who puts it on a shelf has to know where it goes. And so when an editor looks at your story, they're going to say, well, it's kind of like in my case, hey, this would fit with Brad Taylor and Mark Greaney and Jack Carr. So I know how to sell it to somebody. If they don't know how to sell it to somebody, it's going to be really hard for you to sell it. And you should know, you should be able to tell them that here are the authors that I write like. And if you can't, then you need to be reading more, because that's the second thing. In genre fiction, you're trying to sell to a particular audience. And just like if you were making a chest of drawers instead of writing a book, you need to understand, does your customer want 5 drawers or 4? Do they want cedar or some other kind of wood? What colors do they want? And the way you know that for commercial fiction is you read and are become an expert on the kind of books your book is shelved next to. And so if you haven't done that or don't know that, I would highly suggest doing that before you start writing a story. Because the second part of that goes back to what we did before. You're going to need to write something that's the same but different. And so if you don't know what the same is because you haven't been reading in your genre, it's going to be really hard for you to understand what reader expectations are and what to deliver that's different, but still the same of what's out there already. That's the first one. The second one is, in order to become a good writer, you have to write, and you have to write a lot. And so in the same way, if you wanted to become a professional basketball player and you thought, hey, I don't need to practice Monday through Friday, I can just take 4 hours on a Saturday and shoot free throws once a week, you probably aren't going to be hitting the NBA anytime soon. And so to become a writer, it takes both writing a lot of words, and it takes doing it consistently. It's the same thing as going to the gym or anything else that you're trying to do. It takes both duration of time and consistency of instances doing that. And so if you're not willing to sit down and write 5 or 6 days a week, you're going to have a hard time getting good enough to be a writer. And then I think the final part, and I can't recommend this enough, is that you learn to be a good or a better writer by being taught how to write by other writers. And the best way to do that, the most cost-effective way to do that, is through good writing conferences. And so when I talked before about Thriller Fest, the people who started Thriller Fest were people like Lee Child and Heather Graham and Steve Barry and Gail Linz, and just titans in the industry. And so it's people who are already successful writers. They were the ones who were teaching classes. And so it's like you get to shortcut the process somewhat, in that you get to learn from people who are doing it well. And so you don't have to have a degree in writing to become a writer, but you have to have kind of that toolkit of, what are the components of a scene? What are the beats in a novel? What is a 3-act structure? How do you write dialogue? And a writer's conference, a good writer's conference, will have classes that'll be able to teach you that.
And these are awesome expert action steps, man. You should charge for that. There should be like a course that you put out there for thriller writers, $9.97, and this should be a part of that, man. It's that good. That is like commercializable stuff.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Don, thanks for taking the time. God bless you for the work that you do. And listener, Don Bentley is the real deal. Like I said, go to Amazon, type in Don Bentley, grab a couple books from the list, and put them in your cart and buy them and start reading them. I know you're going to love them. And, make sure that you buy a few as gifts for friends and family, for, birthdays, Christmas, and other occasions where you're a gift giver. And I'm a big believer in giving away books as gifts. I bought a bunch of your books in the past and gave them away as gifts. I've done that with other writers as well. I think it's really, really important. We live in a time where a lot of people are looking down their noses at reading, and I think that's a big mistake. In this crazy digital world, reading an actual paper book that you can hold in your hands, there's nothing like it. I listen to stuff all the time, and I understand some people like to do Kindle type reading because it just saves space in their house. But look, this
Sure.
background of mine, this is a real background. This is the office of Nicky Billou, and I think it's one of the things that makes me a better human being. So read books and give.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, Nicky. I really appreciate it.
You bet, man. And that wraps up another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. To find out more about today's amazing guest, the one and only Don Bentley, go check out the show notes at thethoughtleaderrevolution.com. If you like the episode, if you like the advice that he gave, give us a nice like, rating, review, and share it with somebody else who appreciates good writing and maybe is a writer themselves. I think they would really benefit from it. Until next time, goodbye.
This episode has been brought to you by eCircleAcademy.com, the proven system to add 6 to 7 figures a year to your thought leader practice.